Black and white voters are disenfranchised by the 1902 Constitution, and now the city is in the hands of an all-white city council. How then does the city develop? What are some of the ways in which racial segregation is maintained and actually expanded?
So this is the interesting part, right? It's the political system allows for, because there are so few people who are making political decisions, they're able to do things that might otherwise would never have passed with a popular mandate. So the first thing we begin to see in the early 20th century is the rise of zoning laws. And zoning laws on their face aren't racial, right? It's a way to reorganize cities to meet contemporary challenges. You can't have this building there, right? This needs to be an industrial zone. This is a residential area. But of course, when you have a handful of people, right, who are bringing their biases to bear on the political process, and this shakes out in terms of race. So some of the first racial zoning laws to emerge come out of Baltimore and Richmond, right, in the 1910s. And what we begin to see, or slightly before there, is the cities being zoned with racial considerations, where African Americans are disallowed by these zoning laws for moving into particular areas. But something else is happening. It's not just that they're being zoned so that for racial considerations, so Blacks and whites can't live together. In many instances, African-American neighborhoods are being zoned so that whites can put things in those neighborhoods that they can't put in their own. Like at the turn of the mid 20th century, Jackson Ward had upwards of like 5 to 6 dumps, right, where the city would put its waste, which means there's an epidemiological disaster in Jackson Ward. So the zoning laws always work, not only to keep residential neighborhoods segregated, but to make sure that whites can put things in Black neighborhoods they don't want in their neighborhoods.
And you know, another thing that I find really, really interesting about the way that Richmond develops, right, is that you know, at least my understanding of it is that, you know, Richmond is segregated at the turn of the century, but you know, Black residential populations exist all over the city. You know, the Black population is not simply contained within Jackson Ward as white city planners would have perhaps liked. And so the city is faced with a choice of, you know, how do we build our city? And again, because of these existing patterns, the choice is, well, let's build outward in ways that we can zone anew and protect these neighborhoods for white residents, rather than focusing on, like, let's rebuild and make sure that the housing stock in the existing city is maintained, is in good condition. And so you have these.
Yeah, it would have never crossed their minds, right? In large part because you have to think about, like, let's think about like the mind of an early 20th century white politician, right? They see the world as, like, you know, this boundless and endless resources. So expansion, right? This is like, it's a mini version of frontierism, man, right? Right. The periphery of the city is a place to be used. It's a place to recreate, right, what's gone wrong in a city. It's a place to there are all of these kind of frontier utopias that emerge, and city beautiful projects where there's a recreation of what they think a city should be, and this becomes a suburban space. And of course, when people think about the world with recourse to race, then that becomes a part of what people think a suburb should be. Because, I mean, for instance, for all intents and purposes, where Monument Avenue is now was a suburb in the early 20th century. The South Side was a suburb. The North Side was a suburb. And so these become a place where city planners and the people who want folks to move into these neighborhoods are free of the kind of anxieties that undergird the quote unquote inner city, if that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely. So there's the creation of all of these new spaces. And as you say, zoning laws make sure that these neighborhoods are zoned for single family homes. Neighborhoods, you know, have restrictive covenants which prevent Black families explicitly from moving into these neighborhoods. And so this you know, creates a safe space for white upwardly mobile families. But, you know, But
That's the whole point.
That's the whole point. But then, but the group that's
point,
left out of that is those, you know, those working class white people, many of whom are disenfranchised by the voting laws, who remain in the city. And in the 1930, most Americans don't own a home. And then
yeah, it's less than like 40%. It's like 40% of Americans.
And then something remarkable happens, right? The federal government steps in and engages in this massive project of social engineering that completely transforms the United States and has tremendous consequences. I'm wondering if you can talk about what happened with the FHA, with the homeowners loan corporation, and the creation of the suburbs.
Right. So we already have the kind of tapestry of racism and residential patterns with zoning laws. And what the federal government, it literally just throws Miracle-Gro on this in the 1930s, right? And what they do is, you know, the FHA and the HOLC are created to, number one, save mortgages that are in default because of the Great Depression, but number two, build a culture of homeownership in the United States. And here we are again, by the way. Well, how might a mid-20th century policymaker think about you know, federal policy in terms of residential patterns and building a culture of homeownership? Well, they're going to think about it in terms of race. Race becomes a determining factor in risk assessment, right? Right. It is the backbone of how racism was built into banking, by the way, especially when it comes to mortgages. So what the federal government does is it creates a color-coded map system, right? Where certain neighborhoods are zoned green and blue if they're in good standing, other neighborhoods are zoned yellow and red if they're risky. Well, how do we decide what risk is? Well, we decide what risk is sometimes because, you know, a neighborhood might be by a waterway that's prone to flooding. And well, who lives in those neighborhoods, right? Working class people, not just Black people, but working class people live in industrial neighborhoods that have been zoned that way, right? By previous policymakers. So these industrialized neighborhoods, the yellow neighborhoods, which are made up of immigrants, new immigrants, Jews, right? Which are made up of some African Americans, these are the yellow areas. But then Black neighborhoods, regardless of their socioeconomic status, are designated red, which means that the federal government either will not insure a home in that area. That's the first part that very few people know. You can't even get insurance in a redlined area, and they won't dole out a mortgage. So that means ultimately that there are all of these federal resources that the government is pouring into white communities at the expense of the red and yellow communities. And so the culture of homeownership that emerges in the 1930s and the 1940s and the 1950s is done with recourse to race. So what we begin to see is by the 1940s and the 1950s, African-American communities do not have the type of federal strategies, or at least federal help, that would allow them to thrive at the rate or the same clip as their white counterparts, because the federal government's not pumping money in there. So you either can't get a loan or you get it at a jacked up interest rate, which in some ways what people were extremely fearful of. So we begin to see the federal government is responsible for segregating the South and the United States, right? As segregationist governments, they're actually working together. So it's local bankers, local governments, and Washington are actually redesigning cities with recourse to race and risk assessment based on race. And this has a profound, they didn't know it then, but it is essentially the components that build the quote unquote inner city.
I mean, what's wild is that, yeah, no, definitely. I mean, the federal government itself is trying to make a good, you know, to invest their money in a way that they think is responsible. And the way that they interpret that is explicitly, do not want to invest in places where Black people are going to or live in, or we don't want to invest in places where Black people are going to move into. Because the FHA is explicitly saying, if you're going to get our loan as a builder, you can't have Black people living in this place, right?
Because and this is how racism, and this is how thinking about things with recourse to race gets institutionalized. So really what you're talking about is the institutional of race in American homeownership, the culture of American homeownership, where when you have these ideas circulating about, like, you know, people's inherent worth or lack thereof based on skin color, that begins to then bleed into the banking culture, and it begins to bleed into insurance culture. So ultimately, people begin to think that there's no way that African Americans can build viable communities. So there's no point in dumping money into them. Well, guess what? Over the next 30 or 40 years, this has a profound influence on the development of these communities or the lack
I mean,
thereof.
it's wild that, so white homeowners freak out when a Black family moves into their neighborhood because they fear that it's going to devalue their home prices.
Mhm.
And they're absolutely right. They're absolutely right because
Think
of
about
what the federal government
it does. Right. Think about what it does. So what it does is you have a system that is kind of like symbiotic in some ways, where these kind of fictitious ideas about race and worth and race begin to influence the way that people behave, and then they kind of work together. Where like the idea that African American moving in your neighborhood will devalue your property actually becomes a reality because right? Because it's institutionalized, so it feeds off of itself, right? Not because it's real, but it's because it's been made to be real by power brokers.
Absolutely.
Right?
And then the other thing that is just so remarkable to me about this period is, right, it's not just that the federal government is discriminating or denying opportunity to Black communities. They are pumping enormous amounts of resources into white communities, right? This is a tremendous redistribution of wealth.
This isn't a footnote to American history. We are talking billions of dollars. Let's think of it this way. In by the 1950s and the 1960s, over I think a good percentage, close to half, if I'm not mistaken, of mortgages in suburban communities were granted by the federal government in some way, right? If it's not half, it's a quarter. Either way, we are talking a substantial amount of money, millions of dollars, and African Americans virtually get none of that money.
Can you briefly also talk about public housing, which is another big federal project, and how public housing also exacerbates residential segregation?
So what you get in the 1930s is groups of people who begin to believe that the government could get into the affairs of housing, right? And so housing projects were first designed for white people, by the way. They were never designed initially for African Americans. They were a way to kind of get people who are upwardly mobile to become homeowners by transitioning through these spaces. So the idea of public housing in the United States emerges in the mid 30s, and by the 1940s, the FHA begins to create these public housing spaces, and they eventually, all of them are segregated based on race. So by the 1940s, what we begin to see are African Americans who are disallowed from moving into particular neighborhoods because of restrictive covenants, because of zoning, and because of redlining, who can't get fair market value for many of their homes. At first, isn't nearly as much as a problem as it becomes when the United States government embarks on urban renewal in the 1940s and the 1950s. So people who are being displaced cannot afford to buy another home in large part because of these bad policies. These bad federal policies and local policies. So a good number of people who are displaced by urban renewal and the kind of forces of modernity in the mid 20th century end up going into public housing. So in some cases, you have former homeowners who are being put into public housing. And what this means ultimately, because they're segregated by race, is the federal government, along with state officials, begins to build public housing units in African American neighborhoods, right? And these are the kind of high rise, especially in the north, but even in places like Richmond, these are densely populated concrete playgrounds that these are places that become areas of profound disappointment. It's amazing what happens to public housing, because it ultimately, at the beginning, it wasn't necessarily seen like we see it now. This was supposed to be a good thing, but it's one of the worst urban. It becomes one of the worst urban strategies.
Yeah, it becomes really stigmatized. A part of that is sort of fear of socialism, I think. But a big part of it is the way in which, like you say, like the federal government makes the determination that public housing is going to be either all white or all black, or it's going to have like a white building and a black building.
And it's never fully funded, by the way. That's another thing, right? So the problem with the inherent fear of socialism in the United States is that wherever we have programs of this nature, which is designed to help poor people and people of color, an idea like this, if it's not followed up with political will, won't work. And that's what happens in public housing. They're usually built haphazardly, and they're not given the types of money by the federal government, especially the types of money that they would pump into home ownership in the suburbs. So these places begin to crumble in on themselves. In large part, there's no economic and political will to make sure that these spaces thrive. So it becomes a kind of self-fulfilling prophecy that, you know, by the 1950s and the 1960s, these places begin to look more reminiscent of what we see now in the 21st century or associate with inner city life.
So you pointed out that a lot of people that are moving into public housing projects are displaced by urban renewal. This is another major post-World War II project. Can you talk a little bit about how what urban renewal was and how it was implemented in Richmond and elsewhere?
You know, American cities before the mid-20th century, many of them were built haphazardly to meet economic challenges and population growth. So in the 1940s and the 1950s, and we'd seen variations of this earlier with City Beautiful projects and the creation of public spaces and public parks, where a way to alleviate urban anxiety is to beautify a city, right? Well, what happens in the mid-20th century is federal and state policymakers and politicians begin to recognize that cities are designed inefficiently. So it's not on its face coming from a bad place, right? That we need to redesign cities to meet the challenges of the automobile. We need to redesign cities to meet, you know, economic and political challenges that people in the 19th century would have never foreseen, right? So, however, here we are, and this is a common theme today. And when I'm talking about, people again bring their biases to bear on the nature of urban renewal. So what we begin to see is a creation of tearing down slums, right? And this is the, you know, thinking back to what I said about projects, you know, slums are created haphazardly. Ghettos are created by design, right? Projects were created by design. And the slums that people inhabited up into the mid-20th century were created haphazardly, and in many instances, just like I said, to meet economic challenges and population growth. Well, these places, if you'd have looked at Church Hill in the 1940s, it looked like a Brazilian favela, right? They're dangerous. They don't have running water, right? They don't have the kinds of things that we associate with thriving cities. So policymakers go in the 1940s and the 1950s and decide to raise these spaces, right? To make cities safer, to make them more beautiful, to make them more efficient. But they also begin to clear these slums, and this is called slum clearance, but they also begin to clear out spaces to make ways for what we would now associate with kind of skyscraper culture and condensed downtowns. So by the mid-1950s, Richmond and any other city in the United States would have began to clear their slums or would have cleared their slums. And then they build freeways, but I'll get to that in a second. But slum clearance in particular is particularly dangerous when you have all of these policies that are already in play. When you have zoning, when you have restrictive covenants, when you have redlining, you are displacing people to make way for a modern city without giving them the types of resources they will need to relocate to thriving neighborhoods. So many of the people who are cleared out of slums during these urban renewal campaigns are either put into public housing, or African Americans are forced to what we call double down in their own neighborhoods, where they would take a home that was in one place, in one space designed for a multi-generational family, split it in half, and there would be 3 or 4 families living in one dwelling. So the density begins to become more familiar with what we associate with urban life. So by the 1950s and by the 1960s, because of these urban renewal campaigns, you have densely populated inner city communities, not just African American communities, right, but Jewish communities and Italian communities and Irish communities, then you have single family dwellings in the suburbs, which are made possible by freeway construction, right, and redesigning urban spaces to make it more accessible to automobiles so that people who live outside the city can access the city either to go to work or to spend money. And there are consequences to this. And the consequences of what I just delineated is that there are people who are sacrificed at the altar of modernity And it's usually African Americans and vulnerable white communities.
Yeah. So can you talk a little bit about the building of the Richmond Petersburg Turnpike and why the city decides to build it right through the heart of Jackson Ward, the historic Black community?
Yeah, man, freeways weren't built oftentimes especially when they come to cities. They're not built on the path of least resistance. They're built on the path of least political resistance, by the way. And Richmonders and state policymakers were very explicit about where they wanted to build the Richmond Petersburg Turnpike and where they didn't want to build the Richmond Petersburg Turnpike. And what do? They do this. I mean, this is a common theme that the usual suspects are sacrificed again at the altar of modernity. So they build a freeway directly through the heart of Jackson Ward, leveling Navy Hill, right? And this freeway severs what at that time was still one of the most thriving African-American communities in the United States, effectively splitting Jackson Ward in half and putting projects on the other side, by the way, which are still synonymous, right, with some of Richmond's most profound problems. The projects that they put on the other side of that freeway are still here, reminding us of the kind of short-sightedness of policymakers. So the Richmond-Petersburg Turnpike goes up, effectively splitting Jackson Ward. And this becomes kind of a beacon of things to come, in that building that freeway not only guts the essence of Jackson Ward, it's allowed to happen because of segregationist legislature and segregated local officials. And African Americans do not have the political will to stage a freeway revolt like their white counterparts would have. See, what we begin to see throughout the United States with freeways is that whites often have the political will and the political power to resist freeway construction in their neighborhoods. And there's a common theme that happens throughout the United States is African Americans do not have the political power, the political voting power to resist the construction of freeways in their neighborhoods. So their neighborhoods are literally sacrificed to make way, ironically, right? Not for access, not for their access, but for access for people who are on the periphery of cities to get into and out of cities faster. And this happens throughout the United States, right? This isn't, I mean, there's a city in the United States with a sizable minority population that doesn't have this problem. And it's allowed to happen in large part because of the political implications.
That's a great point, right? So you create the creation of these all-white suburbs and the interstate highway system are built in lockstep, right? You need the highway system to connect the new suburbs that are federally backed to the cities, and then, as you say, in all of these cities, they're running right through and displacing Black residents.
Think of it, very few people know this. The movement of white Americans to America's suburbs in the mid-20th century is the greatest migration of human beings in the history of humanity. We're talking about 60 to 70 million people that moved to the suburbs on these freeways. Here's where it really gets ironic, right? It's done on the dole. It's the federal government that built the inner city and the suburbs at the same time. It's the federal government that segregates the United States. They not only build the inner city and the suburbs at the same time, the very people that the federal government encouraged to move out to these suburbs, many of whom were on the dole, end up being Republicans 15 years down the line.
Well, because that actually
late 1960s,
because by owning a home, now you have a stake. You have a model of an engine of wealth creation, and it is the defense of that newly found wealth that then becomes the spur for that shift in the politics of the suburbs.
Yeah. So what they do is once they get out there, they close the proverbial door on everybody else, right? I mean, think of it this way. In some ways, the civil rights movement, and this is all happening during the civil rights movement. People think of the civil rights movement as as an attack exclusively on segregation and public accommodations. No, it's about African Americans knew what was going on. They knew all the things that we're talking about. They recognized without political power, this was going to continue apace. And in some ways, what the civil rights movement are African Americans asking for their own New Deal, right? Because they saw the federal government build the white middle class in the 1930s, the 1940s, and the 1950s. And they're like, well, right? But the problem, and this is a continued problem in the United States, white folks have been able to use the federal government in a way to make their lives livable, to become middle class. But African Americans who make the same demands, their demands are often pathologized, by the way. When African Americans make demands in the federal government, Americans often think that that's them wanting a handout. What most Americans don't recognize is that most white communities in the 20th century got a federal handout to become part of the middle class in the first place. And all civil rights activists were asking for was nothing more than what their white counterparts got 10 to 15 years